Good morning. My name is Jan Sarabi. I'm head of Agri SA's Natural Resources Centre of Excellence. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's webinar. Sustainability and the acronym ESG, which stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, has really become a buzzword and is starting to surface in multiple sectors throughout our economy, including agriculture. This morning, we'll be discussing ESG and its particular relevance to the agribusiness sector, and hope to provide you with an overview of what the most relevant considerations are. James Brand from ENS Africa, Africa's largest law firm and also corporate member of Agri SA, will start by providing an ESG 101, so to speak, to lay the foundation for an understanding of what ESG is and why it is relevant for the agribusiness sector and what the sector can expect in terms of future ESG regulation. Mansour Parker, also from ENS Africa, will hone in on a relevant consideration when looking at the E of the ESG inquiry by providing an overview of the carbon tax regime and what this means for agribusiness. You'll also identify significant opportunities for those agribusinesses that get ahead and start anticipating the shift to operating more sustainably by identifying the opportunities that present themselves with regard to our carbon tax offset regulations. And then finally, Kobus Pienaar from Woolworths, also a valued corporate member of Agri SA, will explore his organization's shift to a holistic, better world and society, and why sound ESG is critical for the survival of the planet and for organizations such as Woolworths. Our webinar will run until 11 o'clock and not 12 o'clock as previously indicated. Following the three presentations, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and presentations will be made available on request and can also be accessed via Agri SA's website. Without further ado, I'd like to invite and welcome my friend James Brand to set our ESG table. Thank you, James. We look forward to hearing you speak.
Thanks very much, Janse. Hopefully you can hear and see me. So yes, as Janse mentioned, today I'll be providing an ESG 101 to provide you with a background as to what ESG is all about, where it came from, and what it seeks to achieve, both in terms of ESG as a risk item that informs where investors place their capital, but also ESG as an impact item that allows companies to better understand the impacts they have on the broader societies they serve and the environment they rely on. I'll provide a high-level overview of how ESG is transitioning from a soft law consideration to hard law obligations, and we'll briefly unpack regulatory developments on ESG disclosures, ESG supply chain due diligences, and ESG taxonomies. I'll then move on to identify how there are pegs in our existing regulatory regime for future regulation of the agribusiness sector to drive sustainable practices going forward. The acronym ESG was coined in 2004 by Paul Clements Hunt in the work he led with his team at the UN Finance Initiative, or UNEP, under the late Kofi Annan. ESG began as a sustainable finance term as part of the investment analysis inquiry to shine a light on unforeseen risks and externalities that were not being considered or priced into the investment analysis. ESG started off as a focus area for understanding risk, based on an assessment by investors of potential impacts on the worth of an investment you're looking to invest in. This is known as the outside-in perspective, as you look at outside factors like climate change to assess the risks this would have inside an organization. For example, crop yield assessments in areas that are identified as being more prone to severe drought in the future. Other examples include factoring in a future carbon price and understanding whether this could have a material impact on the risk weighting of an entity you're looking to invest in. This assessment of ESG as a risk item is also known as single materiality and refers to information that would be considered material if it would assist investors in predicting an entity's future cash flows over the short, medium and long term. To answer the question whether investors were required to consider ESG risk in their investment analysis as part of their fiduciary duties, UNEP commissioned the international law firm Freshfields to consider this, and in 2005 Freshfields published a report titled A Legal Framework for the Integration of ESG Issues into Institutional Investment. This report was led by Professor Paul Watchman and concluded that integrating ESG considerations into an investment analysis so as to more reliably predict financial performance is clearly permissible and is arguably required in all jurisdictions. Both Paul Clements Hunt and Paul Watchman spoke at the first ESG legal summit held late last year, and their panel discussion on ESG is on the internet and is worth watching. So it was really these two acts in 2004 and 2005 by UNEP and Freshfields that kickstarted ESG as an investment concept. Here in South Africa, 6 years later, in July 2011, amendments to our regulations under the Pension Funds Act came into effect and included a new requirement in Regulation 28 for pension funds to consider ESG issues and assessing factors that materially affect long-term performance of retirement fund assets. Recently, in October last year, our National Treasury indicated that this requirement to assess ESG risk be expanded to all financial institutions and not just pension funds. This was set out in their policy paper titled Financing a Sustainable Economy, and indicated that there was an intention on the part of National Treasury to potentially expand the relevance of the ESG inquiry beyond just our pension fund sector to other financial sectors, including banks, collective investment schemes, private equity players, capital markets, and the insurance sector. This is part of a global trend that we're seeing that is seeking to take the learnings from the 2008 financial crisis and really shine a light on risks that would otherwise not be factored into the investment analysis. It's usually the risks we're not thinking about that creep up and cause us problems. In the 2008 financial crisis, those unforeseen risks related to subprime assets. And 14 years later, our financial sector and its regulators are wary of a repeat of not taking into account risks that are currently mispriced, misunderstood, or undisclosed, most notably climate change risks. Principles for Responsible Investment, or the PRI, were developed by an international group of institutional investors reflecting the increasing relevance of ESG issues to investment practices back in 2005. This initiative gave rise to the PRI 6 Principles of Responsible Investment that were developed by investors and are supported by the UN and identified on the right here on the slide. The number of PRI signatories has dramatically increased over the years, as you can see in the slide, and now has more than 5,000 signatories from over 60 countries, including many South African financial institutions, which means that over $120 trillion of assets should be managed in an ESG-aware manner, which presents significant opportunity for sustainable agribusinesses that have positioned themselves to operate sustainably. ESG considerations are relevant to financial institutions looking to allocate funding to ESG, but it's also relevant to agribusiness looking to attract sustainable finance. If an agribusiness is ESG aligned, it will enhance its ability to attract ESG related finance. So what determines whether or not something is ESG aligned? At present, our financial sector applies a number of voluntary national and international frameworks to make this determination. This slide is taken from the National Treasury's policy position paper I mentioned a moment ago that was published last year on sustainable finance and identifies those ESG related frameworks that our South African banks are signatories to. You'll see reference here to the Land Bank, Standard Bank, Nedbank, First Rand Bank, ABSA, and Investec, all of which subscribe to one or other ESG related framework. Sustainable banking in South Africa predominantly relies on these voluntary initiatives, the implementation of which is not mandatory and is not currently supervised by the regulator. But the policy paper published by National Treasury suggests that the principles for responsible banking, for example, could form the basis of a regulatory framework for the banking sector on ESG in the future. So when it comes to ESG as a risk item, it's possible and likely that banks will see a shift from these soft law frameworks to more hard law obligations, similar to what we see in Regulation 28 for the pension fund sector. But ESG is being used in a second way, in addition to ESG as a risk item, which is what we've been speaking about up until now, and that is in considering ESG in terms of impact. The second way of viewing ESG arises from the question as to whether companies have an obligation to act in the best interests of society, the economy, and the environment to assist in addressing, or at least not exacerbating, the types of issues that you see in the slide. Question asked when looking at ESG from an impact point of view is, should companies pursue aims outside of profit to ensure that we have a more balanced, inclusive, and sustainable world? There's long been a debate as to whether it's appropriate for corporations to be concerned with whether they're acting in the best interests of our society, economy, and the environment. Friedman and his colleagues at the University of Chicago didn't think so, and put forward an economic theory which provided that management's only duty was to maximize shareholder value. This cartoon in the middle of the slide is taken from a book called Reimagining Capitalism by Harvard professor Rebecca Henderson, and captures the crossroads that we're at, as rightly or wrongly, we're beginning to see a shift away from this traditional economic model premised solely on shareholder value. ESG is being used in a second way as a means to broaden the scope of the inquiry beyond just shareholder value in terms of profit, in recognition that companies have a role to play in acting in the best interests of our economies, society, and the environment. In this regard, ESG is being used and viewed from an inside-out perspective to understand the impacts an entity has on stakeholders outside of an organization more broadly. This dual approach to considering ESG both inside-out in terms of impact and outside-in terms of risk is sometimes referred to as double materiality. And although we are busy witnessing heated debate and pushback as to whether ESG impact should be a relevant consideration in the US, in addition to ESG risk, the early indications are that this double materiality approach to ESG, and taking into account both ESG risk and ESG impact, is what will be adopted in the EU as well as here in South Africa. So what makes up the ESG inquiry? We've spoken about climate change as a risk item, but what other considerations are relevant when talking about ESG? As you can see from the slide, the ESG inquiry is extremely broad, and each listed item here can be unpacked into its own body of granular detail. Broadly speaking, though, on the E side of the inquiry, you'd look at things like climate change, for example, what your carbon footprint is and what measures are being taken to reduce this. Natural resource use, for example, what your energy and water footprints are and what measures are being taken to improve efficiency. Pollution and waste, for example, what pollution control measures are in place on your farms and how you're avoiding or minimizing waste, and where this can't be done, how are you tapping into the circular economy to reuse or recycle waste. From the S side of the inquiry, we look at things like human capital, for example, labor management, health and safety, and compliance with labor laws. This will also cover things like transformation and diversity. Product liability, for example, whether development of your product fell within all applicable chemical thresholds and is safe for use. On the G side of things, you'd look at things like corporate governance, which would include things like the composition of your board, remuneration policies, as well as accounting practices, and corporate behavior, which would include things like business ethics, tax transparency, and ensuring you have adequate policies in place that are being implemented to avoid bribery and corruption. So if ESG was coined in 2004 and laws requiring ESG to be considered in certain instances in South Africa were passed in 2011, why the noticeable uptick in ESG more recently? We are living through fast-moving times, and the drive towards operating sustainably is in the headlines and is everywhere you look. It's not entirely clear why there has been this noticeable uptick, and commentators are asking why now? What needed to be put in place for ESG and the drive for sustainability to happen? Perhaps we needed to have the experience of the 2008 financial crisis to understand what unforeseen or unpriced risks can do to our financial systems. And perhaps we needed to experience a global pandemic to provide a collective reflection on what forces of nature can do to our economies and societies. Elevation of ESG is also partly driven by stakeholders beyond the shareholder group that are demanding change, particularly in the younger generations, but it's also driven by reputation-related considerations as consumer demands shift to more sustainably aware choices. There's more and more data coming through indicating that those companies that have embedded ESG criteria into their operations outperform their peers by having a better handle on risk, so there's an economic driver as well. There are also legal and regulatory standards suggesting a failure to fully understand ESG risk is inconsistent with the director's fiduciary duties. And then finally, the law is maturing in this space, and we're seeing a move from soft law to hard law obligations, which I'll unpack a bit further later on in this presentation. But one of the major drivers for the ESG inquiry and consequent regulation in the agribusiness sector going forward is likely to come from the inescapable fact that we are operating as a species beyond identified planetary boundaries. The scientific community recognizes that life on Earth can only exist within the safe operating space of 9 identified planetary boundaries. These are fixed boundaries that we need to operate within if we are to continue to enjoy life as we know it for generations to come. This year, scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Centre confirmed that we had just crossed the safe planetary boundary for water use, taking the total breaches of planetary boundaries to 6 of the 9 identified boundaries in which we need to sustainably operate. So we need to look up and really focus on these 6 significant challenges, with climate change being just one of the 6. These are complicated and intergenerational issues, as solving these issues will start with our generation, but will almost certainly be something that future generations will need to continue to solve. From a short-term investment or corporate point of view, the impacts of exceeding planetary boundaries are not immediate, as ice caps melt slowly, for example. So it could be argued that the physical risks of these transgressions are not immediate and are therefore not relevant. But we are already experiencing the impacts of persistent droughts or intense rainfall events, high temperatures and humidity that affect animals and crops directly, as well as incubating new pests, all of which create volatility in production for the agribusiness sector. But it's not only these physical risks that are relevant to the agribusiness sector, it's also the regulatory and transition risks relating to new laws and a decarbonised economy that are also relevant. And I'll look to explore these regulatory and transition risks a bit further in the slides to follow. Earlier I mentioned that ESG is moving from soft law obligation to hard law regulation. In this regard, looking at what is coming out of the EU with regard to ESG regulation provides a very useful insight into where regulation in this is likely to be going, as things are developing in the EU at a serious pace as a result of the EU Green Deal, where the regulatory building blocks for an ESG framework are being developed. Each of these building blocks are new regulatory areas, and as they mature, agribusinesses will need to anticipate having to comply with these new areas of the law. This slide identifies the names of 4 key regulatory building blocks and the regulations that have been published in the EU in the left-hand column, and what our South African equivalent is at this stage in the right-hand column. Our National Treasury is extremely active in this space at the moment, and the indications are that we'll be following something similar to what is coming out of the EU over time in regulating ESG-related risks and moving from soft law obligations to hard law requirements. As I've already covered the background to the ESG investment obligation, as regards ESG risk, the first building block you see in the slide, I'll briefly speak to the last 3 of these building blocks on ESG disclosures, ESG supply chain due diligence, and ESG taxonomies in the slides that follow. The first regulatory building block to unpack a bit further relates to ESG disclosures. The free market operates on the basis that the market is perfectly efficient, but this is based on the assumption that market prices reflect all available relevant information. It's recognized that many externalities are not priced into the market, and relevant information on this is not disclosed and is not available. It's the scope and quality of information that this first regulatory building block seeks to focus in on. There's a lot of work going on at an international level to harmonize existing disclosure frameworks, and in the same way that financial reporting standards evolved and was eventually set in the accounting space, we're starting to see the equivalent for sustainability reporting. Distilling these various frameworks and adapting them to the South African context, the JSE got ahead of the game and published its draft sustainability disclosure guidance document in December last year, and public comment on these guidelines closed in February this year. This is a lot of detail to be cramming into a slide deck, as each color here represents the E, the S and the G metrics that are recommended to be disclosed for companies listed on the JSE. But don't worry about the detail. The purpose of giving you insight into the detail is to get those agribusinesses listed on the JSE thinking about how they're going to be building out the systems required to gather all of this data so as to make the required disclosures. It's a formidable task, and the sooner you start on this journey, the less catching up you're likely to have to be doing later. Further disclosures and metrics laid out in the JSE disclosure guidelines will not be mandatory. They're an important step forward in allowing investor companies to compare apples with apples and sensibly compare different entities on a sector-by-sector basis based on the same disclosed information, allowing them to have a better handle on the evaluation of risk as part of the investment analysis. In recognition of the double materiality approach that I mentioned a bit earlier to ESG, the recently published JSE draft disclosure guidelines recommend that firstly, in respect of ESG risk, that this be reported on in an annual integrated report that includes financial as well as material ESG items. And secondly, in respect of ESG impact on the outside economy, society and environment, that this be reported on in a separate sustainability report. But even if you're not listed on the JSE, but if you supply to a listed entity, you can expect those listed entities requiring similar disclosures down their supply chains to allow them to make their own disclosures. So this is expected to have a cascading effect. So getting to terms with what may be required from a disclosure point of view and anticipating this and building out the systems for such disclosures and gathering the required data is going to become increasingly important. The second regulatory building block to unpack a bit further relates to ESG supply chain due diligence. Most companies' ESG related impacts come from supply chains, and we see this in the press from time to time in the form of deforestation to make way for palm oil, child labour practices in the tea and cocoa sectors, or other human rights abuses arising from supply chains involving minorities in China. But most supply chain managers don't have visibility into sustainability practices throughout their supply chains. In February this year, the European Commission adopted a proposal allowing the EU to indirectly regulate the affairs of non-EU companies that do business in the EU up to the specified thresholds in the slide. Although this directive on corporate sustainability due diligence is not yet binding with legal obligations, affected companies in South Africa that export into the EU are starting to take note so that they have the systems in place to allow for compliance in due course. If a company meets the specified criteria in the slide, then they'll have to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence, which satisfy the requirements of the directive. But even if these thresholds are not met directly, companies which have existing business relationships with EU enterprises that are subject to the directive's due diligence obligations could also be indirectly affected. This is because operations throughout the value chain of the regulated enterprise will be scrutinized in a cascading manner, irrespective of which country they're in. And the third and final regulatory building block to unpack a bit further relates to ESG taxonomies, which seek to set criteria to allow for an assessment as to whether an economic activity is legitimately sustainable. Given that there's over $120 trillion available for ESG investment, as I mentioned earlier, there's criticism that ESG labels are liberally slapped onto existing products, assets, or companies as a means to tap into this finance, and there's significant scope for taxonomies to assist with this. Greenwashing is the act of intentionally or unintentionally misleading consumers regarding the ESG practices, performance, or credentials of a company and their disclosures. Taxonomies are a tool to reduce greenwashing risk. 2 rounds of our taxonomy have been subject to public comment in South Africa, and the finalized version of our green taxonomy was published in April this year. This is a non-binding guide, so it's not mandatory, but reference in this 190-page taxonomy exists, indicating how this taxonomy may be incorporated into existing laws so as to become more binding in the future. Our taxonomy is similar to what we see in the EU and covers multiple sectors, as demonstrated in the slide that is lifted from the taxonomy, with specific requirements being set out for each sector for what would be considered sustainable best practice. ESG alignment with the taxonomy involves a three-step approach. The first step involves a technical assessment to determine whether water consumption or air emission thresholds are met, for example. And if these are met, the second step of the inquiry is to confirm whether or not the activities do no significant harm. And if that assessment succeeds, you then move on to the third step of the inquiry to assess the minimum social safeguards, involving assessing compliance with a host of South African labour laws and international social standards. This is to avoid a scenario where you may have an agribusiness that is adopting regenerative agricultural practices that tick all the climate change boxes, but could be failing to comply with South Africa's water or labour laws, for example. All steps of the inquiry are met, the relevant activity could be disclosed as taxonomy aligned. From an investor point of view, the taxonomy allows investors to use the taxonomy to evaluate risks in their own portfolio and to compile disclosures in terms of their own underlying exposure. From an agribusiness point of view, the taxonomy allows agribusinesses to compile disclosures against the taxonomy that can assist them in attracting favourable sustainable finance on the basis of being taxonomically aligned. So the obvious question is, have sustainability standards been set in the green taxonomy for the agribusiness sector? The answer is that the economic activities of crop production and livestock production are pegged in the taxonomy. However, the related technical standards for what would be considered ESG-aligned activity are not yet developed, and there's a reference in the taxonomy providing that these standards will be developed in the future. However, detailed standards, as seen in the screen grabs here in the slide, were provided in earlier drafts of the taxonomy, but were dropped in the final version of the green taxonomy for future development. So this is something to watch going forward, as once published, this will allow for a better understanding of the technical benchmarks that will be applied to crop production and livestock production for ESG alignment. As these details emerge and mature, this will then allow the agribusiness sector to use these criteria to determine ESG alignment that can then be disclosed to unlock sustainable finance or secure favourable finance terms. This pegging for future regulation is similar to what we see in the Carbon Tax Act, where crop production and livestock production is also identified in the relevant schedules, but is not yet regulated directly as far as emissions are concerned. And Mansour, my colleague, will speak in greater detail about this after I finish. This pegging for potential future regulation is something you also see in the greenhouse gas reporting regulations under the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act, where a place marker is also left for the agricultural sector. So though we have these pegs for future regulation, because of the complexity of our food production systems, as well as food security sensitivities, any regulation is likely to be introduced gradually and cautiously as part of a just transition. I'd like to finish off with this quote from Winston Churchill that perfection is the enemy of progress. The ESG regulatory regime is in its infancy and is by no means complete nor perfect, but this need not prevent progress, as there are already significant motivators to allow agribusinesses with foresight to be early movers in this space. Those agribusinesses that are slow to the game may find themselves iced out of the new sustainable economy in the future, while those that begin to build out the systems required to operate sustainably are likely to benefit, not only in terms of attracting sustainable finance, but also in terms of the ability to anticipate and therefore better deal with future risks. I hope that this presentation would have assisted in raising awareness of the challenges ESG presents for the agribusiness sector, but has also assisted in raising awareness of the business opportunities that are out there for ESG-aligned businesses. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Mansour, who will be speaking about carbon tax and carbon offsets.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. My name is Mansour Parker from ENS Africa's Tax Department. I will be speaking about carbon tax and carbon offsets, and there's a few key points that I would like to leave with you in the next 10 minutes that I'll be chatting to you. If you could flip the slide, James. The key takeaways is that the AFOLU sector is not currently liable for carbon tax, which does present certain opportunities for it. Particularly number 2, we're one of the leading local climate change consultancies declared that farmers who practice certain sustainable farming practices can earn extra income through carbon credits. And then from a tax point of view, the area which I specialize in is that the domestic sales of these carbon credits could qualify as offsets under the Carbon Tax Act. But in order to make the decision, you'd have to compare the cost and administration of the entire carbon auditing, verification, and certification process with the financial benefits thereof. And where you're dealing with smaller farmers and smaller holdings, there is an aggregator type model that can assist you in accessing these types of revenues. We can go on to the next slide, James. So currently under the Carbon Tax Act, the AFOLU sector is not liable for carbon tax. This is by virtue of certain tax-free allowances which are pegged at 100%. So although there are emissions, there's a 100% exemption for those emissions. In the past year, you've seen amendments to the Carbon Tax Act where certain categories, the words not applicable, were removed and were replaced with certain thresholds. As you will see from the next slide, James, it does not lead to any obligation to report emissions to SARS for carbon tax purposes. The reason is that the requirement to obtain a license for carbon tax purposes is removed or does not apply when the words not applicable applies, or you have a basic tax-free allowance of 100%. So even if you're involved in an area where the threshold has been increased, that threshold might be relevant for reporting to DEFI, Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, but not for the purpose of obtaining a license and paying any carbon tax to SARS. So the position will remain as is, that AFOLU sector is not liable for carbon tax. Thank you, James. As a result of it not being liable for carbon tax, there's certain practices which farmers can do. And this, in the past year, we've seen some local consultancies state that there are standards and methodologies available to farmers. Now, this is the carbon consultancy part of this analysis, which as a tax lawyer doesn't deal with, but it's the first step in the process to determine is there an applicable standard, is there an applicable methodology from which you can obtain these carbon credits, which can then be monetized. Thank you, James. Now, from a commercial point of view, what we have seen is that domestically, at least, the price of a carbon credit tends to track the carbon tax rate. So the carbon credit would typically trade at a price of, say, 80 to 90% of the rate of carbon tax. So where the carbon tax rate was 120 Rand in 2019 when it was introduced, then you could possibly expect to sell a carbon credit for about 100 or 105 Rand. And the key issue became, can you generate the credit for less than that amount? in order for it to be sold. Now, at those numbers, there were many carbon certification processes which are simply uneconomical. However, in February this year, Treasury announced the future price pathway for carbon tax, and they're anticipating steep increases in the rate of carbon tax until the end of the first phase, which has been extended to 2026, and further increases in that rate of carbon tax up until 2050. As a result of these steep increases in the rate of carbon tax, it follows that the price of the carbon credit will follow that increase and be pitched at about 80 to 90% of the price of that carbon tax rate. But that's the domestic opportunity. The international opportunity is that the standards under which carbon credits can be created are international. So there is a possibility of international sales as well for these credits. And if the international price is significantly higher than the domestic price, then you've got the two options available to you. But the reason why I thought I'd highlight the domestic scenario is that with this future price pathway for the carbon tax rate, it means that these credits are likely to have far greater value than they currently have in the domestic market. Thank you, James. Now, from a process point of view, a farmer who wishes to participate in this process would have to do several things. Number one, appoint a carbon consultant so that you can work out with a carbon consultant what data would be required, and there'd be involvement of independent auditors to get the credits verified, certified, and then the application to the body which administers the standard for the carbon credits to be issued. This became a stumbling block for farmers who did not have the scale to engage in and incur the cost of all these types of activities. And what we've seen developing is a type of a grouping or an aggregator type of model, whereby farmers with smaller holdings could aggregate their credits together with others in a single scheme. And if you go into the next slide, James. This aggregator model is just typically the area where we get involved as legal and tax practitioners. The aggregator model would involve the landholders entering into some agreement with the aggregator, typically called a usage and rights agreement, but it really depends on the legal description of what's being done. Is the aggregator buying the credits from the farmer and then reselling them? Or is the aggregator acting as an agent on behalf of the farmer and selling the credits on the farmer's behalf? These would affect issues such as where income tax is payable, where VAT is payable, and just generally the cash flows, so that ideally from a tax planning point of view, what we always like to get to is a situation where you can match a cash event with a taxable event. That if there's a taxable event which triggers a cash payment to SARS, you'd want to have cash in the bank to make that payment. You don't want there to be a disconnect where the taxable event happens on day one, but the cash will only be received 6 to 12 months later, and that's what causes the cash flow difficulties. So these aggregator models, we've seen different formats being developed. We've seen some offering an online platform for registration. We have seen others where there's a more bespoke model that's put in place between the landholder and the aggregator, and there's typically an operator of that model, and the operator, which would normally be the carbon consultant, would then state how this model is intended to operate and how multiple farms and landholders can participate in this model. The benefit that it gives is that the aggregator and the operator will then be responsible for entering into the emissions reduction purchase agreements with the carbon buyers, whether the buyers are domestic buyers or international buyers. And then the registry, whether it's gold standard or VCS, would then issue the credits and check that the methodology meets the requirements of that particular standard. If you can go on to the next slide, James. So just to recap, and it was a very quick introduction. It's that AFOLU sector not currently liable for carbon tax. That will remain in place at least until the end of the first phase in 2026. SA farmers can earn extra income through carbon credits. That's the carbon consultancy part of this analysis. So you'd have to have discussions with a carbon consultant on which a standard with methodology will be applied, because that methodology will have the conditions with which you must adhere for the generation of these credits. There is potential domestically for them to be sold as carbon credits to entities who are subject to the carbon tax. And as those entities pay higher rates of carbon tax, they will pay more for the carbon credits. The administration must be compared. If it's too cumbersome and too burdensome on your own, look at a grouped or an aggregated type of model where you can combine with other landholders, and then the auditing and verification costs will be shared amongst all the participants in that project. And that aggregator model will enable you to obtain economies of scale for this. Thank you very much, James. I'll now hand over to Quibus Pinar. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Janssen and team for inviting me to share a few experiences we have in Woolworths closer to the agriculture space in such a relevant topic as environmental and social governance. Before we dive into, before we dive into what we do at Woolies in the agriculture space, I think we just need to look at a few fundamental emerging principles that's happening internationally. So if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, this new illustration that was developed by Carl Volcker and other scientists, it implies that economics and societies are seen as embedded parts in the biosphere. We can't separate them anymore. This model changes our paradigm for development, moving away from the current sectorial approach, where we tend to trade off social with economics, with environment. That's not the way to move forward, according to them. And now we must transition towards a world logic where economics serves society, so that it evolves within the safe operating space of our planet. So no separation anymore. So economics and societies must be seen as embedded parts of the biosphere. This is a big shift internationally. So when we want to change our paradigm for development, moving away from the current sectorial approach, and we have to operate within the planetary boundaries, then shareholder value and shared value, I'm afraid, is not going to be enough anymore. We have to adopt the system value approach where absolutely nothing hinders or prevents society's progress toward future fitness. And that's a tough ask, and it needs a lot of investment, and that's James's argument about short-term profit and long-term sustainability. The system that we talk about encompasses resources in agriculture space like land, soil, crop, farm animals, machinery, water, biodiversity, etc. Activities like growing, harvesting, researching, processing, packaging, transporting, marketing, consuming, and managing nutrients. And people, which includes farmers, bakers, policymakers, processors, input suppliers, researchers, etc. So it's a whole value chain that needs to be involved if we want to move to this new paradigm, where we must become masters of complexity and systems thinking. So you understand that you manage a system, not individual parts. For that, we need hard data and soft data. Data is critical, otherwise it's very difficult to make any decision. So when we engage, is we look at all our direct partners in this whole space that we play in. And first, we need to look at our farmers. In Woolworths, farmers is very important to us. And when you ever engage with farmers, this is quite often the topics that come up. Being a farmer in South Africa is not the easiest job. Rising input costs, especially this year, and other external factors which I can't control, is quite a big challenge. Food inflation, reducing demand. We've seen certain export markets, and even in South Africa, that the demand for certain commodities has dropped. Decline in health and functioning of our supporting underpinning natural systems. That basically is declining because of the way we farm. We need to change our thinking process. We need to farm our farm as an ecosystem, not as a factory. Lack of support when there's a crisis. The last drought in the northern part of the Cape is quite an example of that, where farmers were supporting other farmers. There was lack of other support for farmers. Floods in KZN is also another example. And there's very little market predictability. Markets tends to shift very quickly because of behaviors in consumers. Increasing competition from cheap imported products is also a threat. And then also the exposure to toxic chemicals. We've got the whole land tenure issue and murder rate on farms, which is quite an issue at the moment. And that long-term predicted climate change in South Africa do have opportunities, but it's going to give us we need to really think on how we're going to build resilience to cope with climate change at the moment. When we look at our customer, is that for customer sustainability means not only supporting the environment, but also society and economy. So even in a consumer space in Woolworths, our customers see it as an embedded system. 23% of our customers see sustainability as important, but a further 56% see it as critically important. And whenever we do a survey with customers and ask them, list from 1 to 10, which is the most important, these 6 questions, as long as I can remember in my 18 years in Woolworths, this come up always in the same order. They want to know, is the food safe? Can they trust it? Specifically, those people that's got young children. They want to know, is it healthy? Don't you sell me products that do not have nutrition? Do I get value for my money? What about the farm workers and the factory workers in your supply chain? How do you look after them? Do the animals that you have in your farm with in your supply chain, do they have a life worth living? And then how do we look after the environment? So it's quite demanding from them, but it's relevant questions. And this is why ESG is such a relevant topic at the moment. So, and while we feel we're leading in sustainable practices, 26% of our customers feel that we can do more. They feel we don't do enough. So that's why our MD in Foods, Zyda Ryland, said that everything we do need to be part of our good business journey, our world of well-being. Everything needs to be in that space. And and that's how we operate. For everything we do, we put firstly, we put a sustainability lens onto that. So just to show you in summary what we do in our good business journey is that we've got 3 ambitions and 10 areas of action. So the first one is better food choices for our customers to eat better, so we can have sustainable nutrition and access to good food and healthy food. And then we address the whole issue around antibiotic resistance. We building thriving communities. That's basically our license to trade. Ethical transformation, economic transformation, and food security is quite important for us. The third ambition is be planet positive, reduce our impact on climate change. So we do have a number of programs working in climate change, packaging, food waste, and responsible sourcing, and that's pertaining to commodities like palm oil and coffee and cocoa, etc. So, so for our farmers in Woolworths is our custodians. So Woolworths source about 85%, more than 85%, of all its raw materials from South African farmers. We definitely have a strong drive to be local. When we do want to import, that team needs to write a very good motivation, and that's usually products that's out of season that we do import. So we realize that if we're not going to look after farmers, we're not going to make it. So we always realize that agriculture is one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, and water usage in South Africa. So your footprint sits actually in agriculture. It's very easy to report on our own emissions and our own improvements. but 20% improvement in our own activities will not have the impact than a 2 or 3% improvement in our agriculture space. So it's very important that we look at our farmers. So to combat that challenge, we introduced a regenerative agriculture program about 13 years ago. So we're quite proud of it, that we started already looking at this. And like James Mansour said, it's not a recipe. It is a very complex thing to work in. So that program that we launched, helping our suppliers to take a data-driven approach. We need to base it on data and sound data and scientific data. The moment you bring in emotions into this, it's going to be a train smash. So the program is designed to help our farmers with suppliers to incrementally improve the environmental performance. The program now includes a number of our farmers, and we are over 700 farms at the moment in South Africa where the program is active. Farmers are at way different levels. It is in the context of that farmer. We do have farmers that's a one-man show. We do have farmers that's got a very good technical structure. So you manage them according to that. But the important thing is continual improvement in the context of that farm. With regards to ethics and social issues, we're working closely with standards like CISA, SEDEX, and WITA to ensure good labor relations, paying fair wages, implementing safe working conditions, eradicating gender and racial discrimination, and the implementation of skills development. Also very important for us on that front. So it's clear that ESG is critically important to Woolworths. To reduce climate risk and to cope with unprecedented situations like COVID pandemic that we just experienced, we must optimize our environmental and sustainable governance performance to stay competitive. And James has mentioned it. Worldwide policymakers and closer to home, our investors want to see all businesses accelerate and prioritize their ESG efforts. In time, you will not get investment in your business if you do not address those issues. We realize that we all need to take ownership and not only to rely on government. We need a well-functioning private sector that must play a pivotal role to enhance employment creation, equitable growth, protection of natural resources, and safeguarding consumers' interests, amongst others. So it's our job. We need to take ownership of that. Internationally, environmental sustainable goals, governance focused funds have seen more than double jump, and we believe that will be the case in South Africa. The pandemic has also made corporate governance a very new and stark task, which requires making important decisions related to business strategies, employee well-being, risk mitigating, and managing stakeholders in an unprecedented environment. It's a very nice tool to help you to build resilience into your business. Agriculture contributes greatly to South Africa's GDP, and the stability of our nation, we believe, rests on the shoulders of only a few commercial farmers. Woolworths' environmental and social footprint sits mainly in agriculture, and therefore we have prioritized agriculture when we plan our environmental sustainable governance. This is our current rating, not bad on their ranking, but we believe we can do more, and we also need to improve over time as we require from our suppliers. To conclude, we need to address this as a system, not as compartments in sustainability, and nothing must hinder society's future fitness. And that may require less profit in the short term to survive over the longer term. All stakeholders in the value chain must take ownership. The notion of that's quite relevant in some cases where it's somebody else's problem. I've got news. It is everybody's problem, and we need to take ownership and improve where we can. We focus on our biggest footprint, where we can make the biggest impact, and a sound environmental, sustainable, and social governance is critical for survival of Woolworths and our planet. I thank you. That's a mouthful in a very short time, but that's it. Thank you, Janssen.
Thank you, everybody, for excellent presentations. We have a couple of questions, and I'm going to be a little bit selective with them, just in the interest of time. Kobus, following from what you said, and particularly due to the fact that I know that you're on a daily basis close to farmers, my first question is to you. Does it make financial sense for a farmer to collect the data and pay an expert to interpret the data to design an improvement program? It is costly, obviously, but does it make financial sense in your view for a farmer to collect and pay for those consultancy services?
Janse, thank you very much. Excellent question. That's usually the debate that goes on. What we do found is where our suppliers, our farmers, and specifically adopt that philosophy of sustainability. And we monitor and we capture data and we interpret data. We definitely see over a longer period an improvement on the bottom line. It all depends where the farm is at that stage. Some farms has been really damaged, so you need to invest to turn that ship around. So initially there's more costs, but over the long term there's definitely an improvement on the bottom line. I must say that it doesn't mean that your input cost per hectare goes down. There's sometimes that a perception that input costs will go down. It is sometimes necessary to increase your input cost per hectare, but to increase your profitability as well. So we definitely saw not a big improvement in total yield, but definitely an improvement in quality. And that opens the doors for farmers that is adopting these good agriculture practices into the market. So yeah, definitely there is economic, how do you call it, that you can grow in your economics, your bottom line will improve over time. It takes time and it takes investment.
Thank you, Kobus. Mansoor, my next question is to you. You said that at this stage, the agriculture, forestry, and other land uses sector is not liable for carbon tax. If the sector is required to make carbon tax payments in the future, how would that affect their ability to generate income from carbon credits?
Thanks very much, Janse. What was interesting when the carbon tax came out, the sector would be exempt for the first phase, and the first phase has been extended from 2023 to 2026. So hence that exemption is in place. The immediate effect is to the extent that it becomes subject to carbon tax and makes carbon tax payments, then it would not be able to sell those carbon credits locally as offsets under the Carbon Tax Act. The Carbon Tax Act says that you cannot generate an offset from an activity which is subject to the carbon tax. So that would close that one pathway which I mentioned earlier, the domestic sales of carbon credits to entities who wish to use them as carbon offsets under the Carbon Tax Act. Now, there might still be domestic buyers who wish to buy them for other purposes, but as offsets under the Carbon Tax Act, that would not be there. However, the international sale route still remains open, because when these credits are created, they're created under international standards for worldwide sale. So when they are created, they typically created on international registry, and the international prices tend to be higher. So it might actually have very little impact on the carbon credit generation potential of the sector and its ability to sell. Just one of those pathways for sale would be closed. Thanks, Janse.
Thank you, Mansoor. Yes, certainly food for thought, and obviously sound financial planning required in that regard. James, I want to ask probably the final question to you. What would you recommend as being the first step for agribusinesses looking to start on their ESG journey when it comes to integrating ESG considerations into their business operations?
Yeah, thanks, Janse. I'd say the first step for your larger organizations is to, the first step, I believe, is to get buy-in from the board as regards strategy and acceptance that ESG does have a role to play in discharging fiduciary duties and understanding what potential material ESG items there are to hone in on and identify as being potential risks to your business. And I think once that first step has been taken, I think the second step for those larger entities is the adoption of some kind of policy which sets out the the flight path of the organization in terms of what its strategy is with regard to integrating ESG into the operations. Some kind of policy document as a roadmap for operations. So I think that those two stand out for me with regard to your larger organizations. Smaller organizations, I think that the four key kind of themes that I see coming through from an environmental point of view in the agribusiness sector that are likely to create or experience greater focus going forward, and I'll touch on what I think those would be. And the first one being food waste. I think food waste is a massive inefficiency within the food system. Globally, it's estimated that a third of the food produced is actually not eaten. And we experience the same in South Africa. I think our statistics are quite similar. And the Consumer Goods Council in 2018 set up this food waste agreement, and many role players have joined onto that to establish what our baseline is. And that food loss is not just at the agribusiness level; that's throughout the value chain. But I do think that we have to be more efficient in how we produce and consume that food. So I think that will become an area of focus. I think water is something that can be looked at in terms of efficiency. Water, our biggest water consumer in the country is the agricultural sector. I think the master plan published by the Department of Water, stipulated 61% of our water use is by the agricultural sector, and we are a water scarce country. And I think the efficiency in how water is used is going to be focused in on. Already we have regulations in terms of the National Water Act in terms of which irrigators are required to meter their water use, and that speaks to Quibus's point on the actual capturing of data. So I would say focusing on water, and then going to Mansour's topic, the focus is on fossil fuels and renewable energy and the like, but we need to accept that the agribusiness sector also is a large contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the discussions will shift and start to include items like soil and the like with regard to regenerative agricultural practices. And then finally, the clearance of land for agriculture, biodiversity is going to experience a greater shift in focus. And it's just ensuring that you're complying with applicable laws. When you develop virgin land or if you clear indigenous vegetation, there are authorizations you require to secure in terms of National Environmental Management Act and Conservation of Agricultural Resources Act. So it's just ensuring that you're complying with applicable laws and that you are in fact authorized to clear to expand your farming operations. So for me, those are the four kind of key environmental themes which I think the sector could focus in on. So yeah. Hope that answers your question, Janse.
Certainly, James. Thank you very much for that too. We've run out of time, and this really brings us to the conclusion of today's webinar. I sincerely wish to thank our presenters, James, Mansour and Quibus, for their willingness to speak to us today on this interesting and very important topic. We look forward to keeping these conversations around ESG and sustainable agricultural and food production practices going. We also want to thank our audience for attending today. We hope you have benefited as much from the presentations as I have. Until next time, I close the webinar. Thank you and all the best to everyone.
Thank you.